Hi, I'm John Frank, and I'm here today with Eric Holder, partner at Covington Burling, a law firm based in Washington, D.C., and former Attorney General in the Obama administration. Our topic today is going to be electronic evidence and law enforcement and digital matters. Eric, you were Attorney General for a period of incredible technological advancement in the United States. Which technology affected your role the most?
I think the emergence of cloud computing really changed in a fundamental way concerns that we had at the Justice Department. Where information was stored, how do you access that information, how do you interact with other governments about and private industry about these kinds of issues. I think if you look from, say, 2009, when I started until the time I left, that the emergence of cloud computing and information storage, I think was probably the most significant change.
Now, as Chief Law Enforcement Officer, you think about enforcing the law, but also fundamental rights. Mm-hmm. How has your thinking on fundamental rights evolved through that period? You know,
I think it's interesting. It became something that was of greater concern to me in my time in office. At the beginning of my time in 2009, I wasn't focused as much on trying to strike that balance. But then with the emergence of cloud computing and the ability to obtain information in ways that maybe 10, 15 years before we had not, you really had to think about, all right, I have to do my job as a law enforcement officer, but at the same time, I want to try to do it in such a way that I protect fundamental rights. And those were questions that I don't think an Attorney General before me necessarily had to face in the way that I did.
In your role, certainly people you think about are inside the United States, but also there's criminal and terrorist activity outside the United States as well. How do you think about the fundamental rights with regards to people in the United States and outside?
I tried not to draw a distinction necessarily. I mean, there clearly people within the United States, American citizens, had the protection of our Constitution. People outside the United States did not necessarily have those same protections. And yet, there are kind of fundamental concerns that I think were legitimate. People, I think, all around the world have this notion of wanting to protect their privacy, especially in this age when so much of what we have routinely thought of as being private and known only to us is now out there, in a variety of means. Pictures that I take can be on the cloud, and then so who has the ability to access, those pictures? Fundamentally different than when I just had a photo album that was in my house.
Certainly, you worked on some cross-border investigations during your time. Can you tell us about one or two and some of the cross-border issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly one of the things that. As the world, we always say the world is getting smaller, but in fact that is true, and there are substantially greater numbers of cross-border cases. I can remember some that involved pharma companies, financial institutions, and again, it became important to be able to access information. I was based in the United States, but I needed to access information perhaps in the United Kingdom, information in France, information in Asia. And then you have to figure out, well, how exactly can we do that in an appropriate way?
And how well does international law enforcement cooperation work? I mean, you'd expect that the mechanisms perhaps aren't keeping up with the modern realities, even if the needs are increasing.
I think there is a desire for international cooperation, but I don't think the mechanisms are all in place to allow that cooperation to occur at the level that all of those who serve in law enforcement would like. There certainly is greater conversation, discussion. There are better relationships now than there were even as I said, 2009 when I started as Attorney General. But there are still barriers, I think some unnecessary barriers that are in place and don't allow for the kind of cooperation that I think people in law enforcement from various countries would like to be able to engage in.
As you think about how we can address some of these issues and take down some of these barriers, what role is there for legislators, the Congress and parliaments?
I think legislators play a critical role in this. I think the way in which we are presently solving these issues through individual court cases or by individual companies making determinations without huge amounts of guidance is the exact wrong way to do this. I think we need to have our legislatures involved and talking to one another and laying out really kind of broad-based, clear rules so that people in law enforcement know exactly how they should proceed. People in the private sector know exactly what it is they can turn over and feel that companies that are being responsible to a legitimate request are not then penalized because they have broken a rule in another country.
The role of the third branch of government, the courts. How your interactions with the court, what role do you see them playing on these issues?
Well, courts obviously can have the ultimate say if there is a dispute. The courts are there to resolve, legitimate disputes. I think we have relied a little too much on our courts. I think legislative solutions are actually the better way to go. Because frankly, legislatures can conduct hearings and can educate themselves, and then hopefully pass legislation that's based on those that education. Courts are presented with a set of facts, two parties, and might not necessarily have that same capacity to educate themselves so that they can decide a case in a way that is best.
Diplomacy certainly plays a role, as one thinks about it. And in your role, you undoubtedly spent time with chief law enforcement officers and attorney generals around the world. Can you talk about diplomacy and what role you see diplomacy playing going forward?
I think the diplomatic part of this is extremely important. One nation cannot decide for all other nations how these issues are to be resolved. They are best resolved when there is agreement, when there is conversation, and that is done through diplomacy. So although it might be a law enforcement issue where the United States Department of Justice has primary responsibility, the State Department of the United States plays a critical role in helping the Justice Department interact with partners in other countries.
One of the issues that we talk about here in Brussels is trying to think about, in the internet without borders, law enforcement and privacy rights tend to have borders, and data in the cloud, on the one hand, it can move around, on the other hand, it's stored and processed in particular locations. Are we moving away from the principle of territoriality?
I don't think we necessarily are. I think that the notion that one nation should not be able to use its police powers in another nation is still a good rule, still a good foundational rule. But that comes into conflict oftentimes with the technological realities that we now confront. And so I think trying to stay true to that foundational concept while being responsive to, cognizant of, the new world, the new capacities that we have is something that we still have to work our way through. But I do think that there is still a lot of life in that notion of not using one nation's police power in another nation.
There are ongoing efforts on both sides of the Atlantic, certainly here in Brussels and Washington, D.C., to build some rules for making e-evidence available on a transatlantic basis. Any advice for policymakers and legislators who are working on this, fundamental ways to think about it?
Certainly educating. Policymakers need to educate themselves about the realities. I think that too often people think in stereotypes as opposed to reality. So I think there's an educational component that is extremely important. Then I think also there's the need for flexibility. There are competing interests here, and I think policymakers have to be aware of the legitimate concerns that you will see on both sides. Law enforcement will have, ideas, concerns, thoughts. People who are focusing on privacy concerns will have thoughts and concerns. And it's not one or the other. There are things that have to be considered on both sides. And so I think that policymakers need to listen and base policy on the basis of an analysis of those legitimate concerns and probably end up someplace in the middle.
Thank you much, Eric, for your time today, and thank you for being in Brussels.
Thank you.